Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to our first session of day 2 of the 2023 North American Virtual Reference Conference. I am Sarah Ptacek, coordinator of AskMN, the statewide virtual reference cooperative in Washington State, and I'll be your moderator for the following session. Attendees, your video and audio have been turned off for the session, but if you have questions, please use the Q&A section, and please feel free also to use the chat section with each other if you'd like. There will be time at the end of the presentations for questions, at least 10 minutes at the end. This session is being recorded like all of our sessions, and it will be made available on our website within the next month. And our presentation today right now is AskMN, Service Learning Experience for MLIS Students. And Joe, Joyce, and Carla, please introduce yourselves and take it away.
Who wants to go first? Should I? I'll go first. I'm Joe Ptacek. I'm a graduate student in the MLIS program at St. Kate's. I'm just over halfway through the program. I'm currently leaning towards pursuing a career in academic librarianship. Last spring in 2022, I participated in the AskMN Service Learning Experience through Joyce's class on information access services. And then later on in the presentation, I'm going to be sharing a bit more about what this experience was like for me as a student, just getting acquainted with reference work.
I'll go next. I'm Carla Pfahl, and I'm the Outreach and Instruction Librarian at Minitex. Minitex is it's an organization based out of the University of Minnesota, and we support all libraries in the state. One of the programs that I coordinate as part of Minitex programs is AskMN, our virtual statewide reference service.
And I am Joyce Yukawa, and I'm very, very comfortable introducing myself last because my name starts with Y, and that's always where I ended up in grade school. But I am Joyce Yukawa, and I am associate professor at St. Catherine University in the MLIS program. And I'm also serving as program director right now. I teach user services, information literacy instruction, and also information ethics.
All right, should we take it away to the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll bring them up. All right.
Why don't you go ahead to the next slide? Okay. I'll give a quick introduction of AskMN, our cooperative service. It's made up of participating public and academic libraries across Minnesota, along with the statewide portal askmn.org. Participating libraries have chat widgets on their websites to the cooperative service. And the cooperative service is made up of the larger 24/7 reference cooperative. So we participate in that, and that's what gives us 24/7 coverage. You can go ahead to the next slide.
Okay.
I think is there another slide that introduces that has a
sure. Sorry. Here we go.
All righty. Yeah, I would like to set the stage by providing the course context. This service learning project is an assignment in LAS 7040 Information Access Services, which is an introduction to reference and outreach services, and it's a required course for all MLIS students. This service learning project emerged partly out of the constraints of COVID. Pre-COVID, one of my course assignments asked students to observe reference interactions in a library of their choice and report on what they observed, tying it to their knowledge of user behavior and best practices in reference. And I also had been doing a chat reference simulation where students role-played librarians and patrons using the library help platform. That was useful, but it was a little bit artificial. When COVID hit, in-person reference observations weren't possible. So fortunately, Carla proposed a collaboration for student staffing of AskMN. And this developed into a really rich learning experience for students. And it was really a wonderful collaboration for me as well. The goals of the service learning project are for students to understand users' information-seeking behavior and needs, demonstrate techniques to retrieve, evaluate, and synthesize information from diverse sources, understand and use best practices for reference, express their own philosophy of reference and information service, understand issues and trends in reference services, particularly remote services, and also gain an understanding of the cooperative nature of libraries. These goals are really similar to my goals for the previous reference observations assignment, but they really go beyond those goals. Students are actually able to provide service rather than simply observe, and they're able to see how libraries cooperate by actually experiencing this themselves. Next slide, please. This is a service learning project, and because it's a service learning project, it has benefits that go beyond experiential learning. First, it benefits both the students and the community. Each student provides 8 hours of service for AskMN while they're being supported and mentored by Carla as the community partner. And students can put theory into practice through meeting the information needs of real users. Second, it's practice embedded in a course that combines academic learning with community service. Third, it involves close cooperation between the course instructor and the community partner, and this was really a wonderful collaboration. Carla will describe her role as a community partner in more detail in a moment, but briefly, her training at the beginning covers best practices for chat reference and using the LibAnswer software. And the training also builds on the course content and readings. And the service learning is supported by a course assignment that's designed to provide guidance and structure for the learning. Fourth, and this is really important, students' critical reflection on the experience is an essential component of service learning. The reference report assignment encourages students to do critical reflection as a professional practice. And I want to turn now to the reference report assignment. Next slide, please. The reference report assignment is the culminating activity, and the requirements encourage a purposeful and personally meaningful experience, hopefully. Students begin the report with a statement of their own philosophy of service appropriate for their own career goals. They also state their personal objectives for the experience and how they met those objectives. Some students wanted to practice providing remote reference services, or they wanted to identify the challenges and opportunities of online reference. Others wanted to know what kinds of questions people are asking. Some students specifically wanted to increase their familiarity with the AskMN and LibAnswer system, so there were a wide range of objectives. Students also described how they conducted their reference conversations. They identify patterns of information need or user behavior. This encourages them to observe closely their users, but also to be aware of their own thoughts, feelings, and actions as they work with users. They analyze transcripts of their 2 best conversations. This is an opportunity to reflect, to raise questions, to recognize successes, and to think more deeply about the reference conversations. They also review all their reference conversations and identify areas needing improvement. And finally, they evaluate the experience, what they learned, and the role that the mentoring and the course played in their learning. Many students were really surprised at the end that they gained so much confidence and skills in doing reference interactions. And they were really satisfied with being able to help users solve information problems. So in short, the assignment supports observation, reflection, and improvement as part of professional practice. So that's my brief overview of the course context, and I'll turn this over to Carla so she can talk about her role as a community partner.
Thank you, Joyce. So To prepare the students for the service learning experience, there was a lot of work on my end. The prep that I took was to, before I even met with the class, I asked Dr. Yukawa to send me the list of the students that will be participating in the class so I can create their accounts. I also create a Google group with all the student emails in them, including Dr. Yukawa and my colleagues here in Minitex, so that everyone is getting the same communication. My colleagues in Minitex would be the ones that are either helping with the mentoring component or in some aspects supporting a supporting role in this project. I'm also in communication with the 24/7 reference cooperative managers, coordinating student access to both the academic and the public global cooperative queues so that they can assist patrons in that global cooperative. And I knew that meeting once with the students for a training session was not going to be enough for first time chat reference providers. And if there were anything like me, they would forget half the things that I covered in the training session. So I wanted to make sure that students were well prepared and well supported through their learning experience and their work. So I created a chat guide that they could refer to if they needed to. In the chat guide, there is information on getting started, step-by-step instructions on chat, best practices. This is what I will refer back to students in their feedback. Excuse me, LibStaffer scheduling, information about how they should go about handling their schedule, and how to access their transcripts. They need to provide a sample of their chat transcripts in their reflection papers at the end of the semester. So they need to know how to navigate through the software to access those. I also provide students with the slide deck from the training session, so they can refer back to that too if they need to. Joe, if you could move that forward. My approach to training is to provide a holistic understanding of chat reference, the software, and the tools used while chatting. I like highlighting some of the course readings they have had up to that point because it gives them a good understanding of the foundations of reference services, which they will rely on when they begin chatting with patrons online. We also go over the reference interview and best practices, which I also reinforce in the chat guide. I share with them the best practices. I'm sorry, the best practices are something I continue to point to throughout the service learning work while they are being mentored. We walk through the software used for the service, LibAnswers, LibChat, and LibStaffer from SpringShare. I want them to feel comfortable with that software, what they're going to be using. And I share staff side FAQs. This 24/7 staff FAQs are the backbone of the cooperative service. They are guides created by each participating library that gives detailed information about a library's services, policies, and resources. And there is a lot of information needed to help patrons as if they were part of that library. That gives them that experience of working with many different patrons from many different libraries, academic setting and public setting. Lastly, I walk students through a chat demonstration to go over all the components involved in chatting. Again, I want them to feel comfortable with that software. Then I hand that chatting over to the students so that they can partner up with their classmates and do some practice chatting. I give them a week to do some practice chatting before they go live with the service. And hopefully if they have completed enough practice chatting, they've got a good firm understanding of that software, and start understanding the tools that they need to use while they're chatting. Students are not just learning about chat reference, but the entire experience of staffing the service, managing their own schedules, and understanding the tools used by the cooperative to assist each other's questions. And if you were here in the beginning, you can see that's my puppy, my dog Wally, and the reason why I bought yak tracks for this winter. Go ahead and move the slide forward. Thanks. Participating in chat reference means managing a schedule. And you would think that that's a fairly easy process, but life has a way of getting in the way of schedules, especially for grad students. I always explain in the training session that the schedule they initially create will most likely change at least a few times throughout the weeks that they're staffing the service, and that it's okay. And that's why we use our scheduling tool called LibStaffer as part of SpringShare, our vendor, to help manage that. So they get a good familiarity with what it's like managing a schedule similar to the professional librarians. Okay, go ahead and thank you. Mentoring was probably the biggest component of the service learning experience from my end. Looking back on my own service learning work as a library student, it was not the best experience. From what I remember, I found it extremely difficult to engage in a conversation with a patron and try to learn more about their information need. I had very little experience with the reference interview other than role-playing with fellow students and trying to figure out how to ask those open-ended questions, but somehow they always came out yes/no questions. And that was a long time ago. That was 22 years ago, before online reference was even a thing. And approaching our first semester, I was trying to think of how to transform that mentoring aspect of in-person service learning work into an online environment. The first thing I did was see if there was any information that existed by other librarians sharing their work. I did a literature review, searching for service learning work in library students and chat reference. However, there wasn't much written about this type of project. All the articles I found were about in-person, at the reference desk, in an academic library setting, and more were about students, non-library graduate students, that were working in a library than they were about the service learning component. The one thing that spoke to me from the articles I was reading was that mentoring, being there with the student, was key to student success. So if I wanted the students to truly find the service learning work beneficial, I needed to be online with them for each of their chat shifts. If I'm not available, I see if one of my colleagues can be there for them. My colleagues work very closely with me, and they're very familiar with this work, so it's easy for them to step in and perform that role. As each student starts a chat shift, I connect with them via the internal chat in LibChat, our software, and say something like, "Hi, I'm here if you have any questions," just letting them know I'm there and I'm available to them. Most of the time, especially in the first 2 weeks, they have questions. Some questions are just about patron behavior, like, is it okay if I haven't heard from the patron in a while? Or when chats come in with no text from the patron, do we just answer them by asking what I can help you with? But often they find that there's a lot of gray area in patron questions, and information needs such as evaluating a source with a patron, help with citation formatting, search strategies, and best resources to use, how to find data to support their research. I also review all of the transcripts from all students weekly and put together highlights of excellent chat sessions and constructive feedback where needed. I try to maintain a positive frame for all of the feedback to make sure they know that there were things that they did well, sometimes really well. Sometimes I take note of and try to use that in my own work. And things that there could be improvement or slight adjustment with similar situations in the future. Okay, let's move forward, and I think we're going to hand this off to Joe.
Thanks, Carla. I just want to start out by saying that overall my service learning experience with AskMN was very positive. I felt that the collaboration with Minitex was well organized and that the integration with coursework was really helpful in bridging theory and practice. In addition, I felt fully supported throughout the entire project. Joyce and Carla did a great job of introducing the service learning experience, conducting training, sharing useful resources, and providing lots of help and mentorship along the way. It was great, for example, just to see that Carla was there in chat in case I needed anything. I found that the actual reference work itself was challenging but rewarding, with a ton of opportunities to engage with and better understand concepts introduced in class. In turn, I felt that the surrounding context of coursework was helpful in becoming a better reference librarian for the patrons I was assisting through AskMN. In a moment, I'm going to go into more detail about my specific experiences conducting chat reference to give folks a better sense for what this was like from my student perspective. Ultimately, I felt the service learning experience through AskMN was helpful in developing new skills, building confidence, and enriching my learning about reference and information services. I enjoyed how opportunities for critical reflection were woven into the experience, and I felt this was especially helpful in developing greater self-knowledge about my strengths and weaknesses, and the sorts of things that I connect with in RIS work. Before I walk through an example interaction, I thought it'd make sense to briefly touch on my background coming into the second semester of the St. Kate's MLIS program last spring, just over a year ago. By the time I was taking Joyce's class on information access services, I already had some prior familiarity with the concept of service learning from my Intro to LIS class. That class also had a service learning component, which involved helping K-12 students with homework through St. Paul Public Libraries. As part of that experience, we took a look at some background readings on service learning itself. I'd say that knowing something about the structure and purpose of service learning helped me to engage with this experience more mindfully. I should point out that the first article given here features authors from St. Kate's. Before working with patrons through AskMN, I had no prior experience in providing any kind of reference or information services. My previous customer service background included some scattered experiences working in food service, but it had been over a decade in my professional life since I had had any kind of strongly outward-facing role. So altogether, this lack of experience with service work had me feeling a little nervous going into my first chat reference sessions, but I'd say that this anxiety dissipated pretty quickly once I actually started working with people. My service work with AskMN took place over a 5-week period between March and April of 2022. Each of my weekly shifts lasted 1 to 2 hours and involved logging into the LibChat interface to monitor either the public or academic queue for incoming reference questions. I tended to work at home from my laptop, often in close proximity to my reference assistant, Magpie, pictured here. As patron questions arrived, I pushed myself to claim these as quickly as possible. Questions vary depending on library type, but I found that many of these were more practical in nature as opposed to people needing help with specific research projects. For example, a number of the patrons I worked with were looking for help in formatting citations, troubleshooting access to e-resources, clarifying local policies and procedures. On the more challenging end of things for me were the patrons looking for research help in disciplines outside my areas of expertise. I'm glad I eventually pushed myself outside of my comfort zone to start claiming these sorts of questions in spite of some initial hesitation. Ultimately, it was affirming for me to discover that my general purpose search skills were developing to a point where I was usually able to help people make at least some headway with their research endeavors, even in unfamiliar subject areas. In the worst case, if I ever ran into any dead ends, it felt good to have the option to connect a patron with a local librarian for email follow-up. In working with patrons, I felt I was constantly engaging with concepts introduced in class. Some of this happened on the fly during interactions. For example, as I worked with patrons and searched online sources, I consciously focused on trying to apply certain best practices for remote reference that we learned about in readings, like maintaining chat contact with patrons to share my research strategies. I also did my best to apply specific tactics we've been practicing in web and database searching, like constraining a web search to somebody's institutional website to quickly check for local resources related to their questions. However, there was a limit to how much I could actively reflect on during reference interactions with patrons, given how much of my attention was already consumed by the reference work itself. Instead, I found it was useful to take some time between interactions to jot down brief notes while specific details about the experience were still fresh in my mind. In my note-taking, I tended to focus on interactions that might be relevant to discuss in my final reference report. According to the requirements of that assignment, I would need to critically evaluate my reference service with respect to established standards. I need to discuss patterns in patrons' behaviors and information needs, and I'd also need to articulate a personal service philosophy. To that end, I tried to keep track of moments during interactions that felt particularly successful or unsuccessful from a service standpoint. I also tried to capture moments that felt especially rewarding for me in one way or another as a way to begin mulling over my personal connections with information service. Finally, I found it useful to document any general strategies I discovered in working with patrons or carrying out searches. And all these notes gradually came to serve as a living document with useful things for me to continue reflecting on and refining in my service. Over time, as I became more confident working with patrons, I felt that my sense for the structure of a reference interview and for the principles of effective reference service became more deeply ingrained. These concepts were familiar enough to me from readings and class exercises, but it wasn't until I actually started working with patrons that things began to resonate on a more intuitive level. In particular, there are certain skills that come into play during a reference interview that I couldn't really work on developing and didn't necessarily appreciate the need to develop until I was actually trying things and learning from my experiences. For me, working with actual patrons was especially helpful in figuring out pacing and keeping track of time. An all hands-on experience through AskMN helped me understand more of the nuance in applying the reference standards we were learning about in class, and gradually make progress towards providing better service to patrons. So at this point, I think it might be useful to spend some time walking through an example of an interaction I had with a patron to give folks a better sense for what this work involved. I'll be referring to de-identified transcripts originally downloaded from the LibAnswers platform, and it was very helpful to have access to these transcripts during the service learning experience, especially when it came time to reflect on and write up a reference report discussing specific interactions. One of my favorite interactions through AskMN involved working with a student from the University of Minnesota. In this person's initial chat message, they told me they were looking for a geocoding resource or a database that records the type of organization by address. This is a great example of the sort of question that started pushing me outside my comfort zone in reference work. Going into this interaction, I didn't know very much about geocoding, but I was willing to take a leap of faith that I'd be able to find some useful sources available through the U of M library. My first follow-up question was to confirm the patron was in fact hoping to use local resources at the U of M. I didn't want to make any assumptions, for example, in case they'd already investigated local options. While waiting for the patron to reply, I launched into my first set of searches. I quickly turned up two very useful libguides from the U of M focusing on geospatial datasets and research tools. I noticed that both of these guides were authored by the same subject area expert. I made a mental note that this person's contact information was available in case we needed it. The guides themselves contained dozens of resources. Not being very familiar with GIS methods, I wasn't sure exactly how People might describe the specific functionality that the patron was looking for, but from what I could gather in my skimming, it seemed like we were heading in the right direction. At this point, the patron got back to me to confirm that they were, in fact, looking to use local U of M library resources. From here, I proceeded to share a link to one of the LibGuides that I'd found. Since I didn't have a specific resource to recommend at this point, I felt it made sense for both of us to continue skimming results in parallel. I made a point to alert the patron I was still investigating things on my end. Within a couple minutes, we narrowed in on a pair of promising-looking resources, Esri Business Analyst Online and Simply Analytics. As I turned my attention to searching for freely available product documentation, it suddenly dawned on me that I should ask the patron to clarify what sorts of organization types they were hoping to include. I was beginning to realize I didn't have any clear keywords in this area to help anchor our investigations. The patron's response was really helpful. They told me they had a list of addresses and that they were looking to classify them according to whether they were residences, businesses, hospitals, etc. This felt like a significant moment in our process of negotiating the underlying question. Now that I had a better sense for the patron's information needs, it became much more straightforward for me to navigate vendor websites in search of relevant information. Sure enough, I soon discovered that Esri Business Analyst includes access to some of the business-related variables the patron was hoping to analyze, and I also learned something about what these acronyms mean, SIC and NICS. I imagine a lot of people in the audience already knew that, but I did not, and so this was a significant discovery for me, which I also shared with the patron. Let's see. At this point, so we continued to make some progress in clarifying the product features, but we did start bumping up against the limits of what we could accomplish without an expert's help. For example, I ended up needing to explain to the patron that I didn't personally have access to any software licensed through the U of M, which sort of limited my ability to investigate the interface itself. At this point, it seemed appropriate for me to recommend following up with a geospatial research expert responsible for the LibGuide that we bumped into earlier. The patron seemed open to this possibility, and incidentally, it was nice to hear that my own assistance was actually helpful. This felt like a pretty successful reference interaction for me, especially for one of my first interactions ever. Although it took a few minutes, I eventually circled in on the patron's information needs and proceeded to identify some useful resources. I especially enjoyed how collaborative this search felt. Over time, I've come to recognize that the social aspects of reference work can be energizing and somewhat fulfilling in themselves. Our search for geocoding resources ended up running a bit long, which is something I'm aware I struggled with, but I didn't get the sense that the patron was becoming impatient. In the end, they seemed to genuinely appreciate the help I was providing. This is the sort of immediate positive feedback that was really encouraging for me to receive at this point in my LIS education. Taking a step back from this specific interaction, I'd like to quickly recap the overall impact the AskMN service learning experience had on me as an MLIS student. It was wonderful to have the opportunity to work directly with patrons. It was perhaps especially useful for someone like me with less experience in customer service. Remote reference was a great way to get jitters out and acclimate to the experience of interacting with library patrons. I feel fortunate that my first ever reference interactions tended to be pretty enjoyable. Over time, working through a variety of more or less successful interactions with patrons was helpful for building confidence in my ability to provide basic reference service. Taking on the responsibility of reference work felt both important and rewarding for me. I found that I really enjoyed collaborating with people and figuring things out together. Not just things directly related to research, but all of the other little information obstacles people run into in a library. I ultimately came away from the service learning experience with a lot of useful knowledge and a fair amount of practice with skills related to reference work. Specifically, this included a deeper understanding of best practices, informal reference standards like RUSA, improved reference service skills, including familiarity with the structure of a reference interview and the process of clarifying ambiguous information needs, and finally, improved web and database searching. I'd say it was especially useful to have practice carrying out searches for another person, which can really take some getting used to. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Joyce.
Thanks, Joe. It's always exciting to hear about student experiences in this project. I learned so much. I want to talk a little bit about what we learned from doing this project. First, some of the challenges. Students had a wide range of experiences going into the service learning. Some had no experience with customer service or chat reference, and some students had already actually staffed AskMN for Minnesota History Day, so they were helping students answer questions about historical research. So there was a wide range, but I think the gift of this project is that wherever students started, they were able to learn something valuable. Also, one of the things that most students were concerned about at the beginning of the project was this initial anxiety about knowing whether they could do good, whether they could answer questions correctly, whether they could do them in a timely manner, And I think this was where Carla's support and mentoring and being with students was so critical, because there were a lot of students who got over that initial anxiety hump because Carla was there to help, and they knew that they could turn to her. Based on the student reports, I think this was a really successful learning experience. We've talked about confidence and building confidence, and I think that's one of the premier things that students got from the experience. And I think as they move forward into their careers, that confidence is going to be really important. They were also highly motivated to search web and library resources to meet user needs in real time, which is different from observing. Actually doing it to serve someone is really different and highly motivating. They also gained satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment. And they gained a better understanding of the cooperative nature of libraries, which I think you get this uniquely in this particular class from this experience, because I talk about it in the abstract, but this is actually learning from participating in a cooperative. And some students felt that this was one of the most valuable learning experiences in the course. Next slide, please. I think there were three key elements that made this project successful. The first was that Carla and I planned carefully the project, but we were also flexible, so that when there were things that needed to be improved, we were able to do that on the spot or between semesters. I think a really critical piece is Carla's leadership and support of students from the beginning to the end of their service. At the start, she described how comprehensive and detailed her training was, and the support materials that she provided prepared students and supported them throughout the service. And then during the service hours, she was there for every conversation. So she helped them answer difficult questions. She helped them get over their anxiety, and she also boosted their confidence. And then after the chat conversations were completed, her feedback on the transcripts helped students gain confidence again and refine their criteria for effective online reference. And a third really important element was regular communication among everybody involved. Carla and I communicated regularly. Carla communicated with the students individually and as a group while they provided service. And the students and I debriefed regularly during class, and the students themselves shared experiences and advice with each other outside of class via the Discord server. Next slide, please. I wanted to end the presentation with a few more comments from students to add to Joe's really excellent description of his experiences. There were a lot of reflections from students, but I selected just a few to illustrate what was important to them and to give you kind of a flavor of the excitement that was generated by this project. The first student really addresses that initial anxiety and how helpful it was for Carla to be there to do the hand-holding, because she was pretty apprehensive about saying and doing the wrong thing. And the second student comment talks about how important all of those resources were as she went through the actual chat sessions. The third student was a student who was already working in a library doing reference work, but this was so interesting and reassuring, was that she felt that this service learning experience and the reflection report were the most important assignments for her growth as a reference librarian. And she said that it immediately started improving her work performance. That was just fantastic. The fourth student comment really focuses on the community service part of this project, and some students really appreciated that. And the last student comment really shows the appreciation for how libraries collaborate to actually support and serve patrons. So, next slide. The end. We do have some time for questions, and Carla and Joe and I would be really happy to answer any questions that you folks have.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I love this project, which is why I selfishly grabbed up this session to moderate. I am happy to start the questions, and also folks, please feel free to put any additional ones you have in the Q&A or chat, and we will get them to our presenters. First question, I was taking little notes during that presentation here. Carla, are you willing to share your training documents for students with other librarians? Awesome. I'll be emailing you. And Carla, I was wondering if you also do chat as well as coordinate the system. Like, are you kind of in there every day too, or it seems kind of like a, okay.
Yep, I do an hour on the public queue and an hour on the academic queue every week.
Nice. I was also wondering what the practice chatting looks like when the students have that week to chat with each other. Like, do you, I'm a little bit familiar with SpringShare, so I'm just like wondering, do you have a special widget that goes only to the students and kind of back and forth to them, or do they go on the actual AskMN platform and just grab them, or how does that work?
Yep, they go to askmn.org, and I typically kind of gear them towards the question on any topic, which is the public queue. And so if the librarian is logged in to that Minitex queue or institution level queue, the person playing the patron will come in, ask their question through that queue. They'll see them first, so they'll be able to grab them right away.
Nice, that makes sense. Let's see here. And so before this was this extremely organized collaboration that you all sort of pivoted to and created during COVID. Did you have like the occasional IMLS student working in AskMN? Were you already pretty familiar with, it doesn't seem like you're new to mentoring, for example, Carla. Did you already have something that was sort of a first step to this before you dove in?
Kind of, still in the first stage of COVID, for History Day, Minnesota is very big on History Day for K-12 students, middle and high school, and partnering with Minnesota Historical Society, we invited some St. Kate students to do chat chips for the History Day hullabaloos online, and this was a slightly different experience. It wasn't centered around as service learning work. It was more towards looking for student librarians that were, or library school students that were already had some experience with reference work, and they were going to be paid for this work too. But I was still there with them.
And Joyce, I was curious about when the project was more about shadowing reference librarians and not doing the reference work directly. How did the assignment sort of differ? I assume it was just more about sort of you go, you watch, you take notes, and you reflect. Like what were the assignments like before they were sort of doing it themselves?
Yeah, it was in some ways similar. I mean, they were already familiar with users' information seeking behavior and best practices. And so they could choose whatever library they wanted based on their career choices, for the future, and actually shadow a librarian. I think that the mentoring part was actually more the conversation that the students had with the librarian they were shadowing. So they could watch what was happening. They could ask later, about why something happened, why something was done, what were the person's experiences, with reference in general. So there was a one-on-one, a more in-depth one-on-one with a reference librarian that they were shadowing, but they didn't have the chance to practice. And I think that's a huge difference. And I think one of the things that Carla did was with her mentoring, she really picked up for all of the students, part of that mentoring work. And so she did a tremendous job. I just, I think it was just so successful because of Carla. And the students are great too. But yeah, there is a difference.
Awesome, thank you. And speaking of students, Joe, I may have missed this at the beginning, but what are you doing now? Are you done with the program, and are you in a library?
I'm about halfway through the program. I'm a little over halfway through the program. I'm currently a graduate assistant at the St. Catherine University Library, and my work is more. I work in a division called Library Collection and Discovery Services, and I do a lot of copy cataloging, and I do systems and metadata work, which where many of my interests are currently aligned.
Nice, thank you. Got another question from the Q&A. It says, thank you all for sharing. Will you be continuing this collaboration? And if so, will there be any changes that you anticipate?
Joyce, you want to take that?
Absolutely. You, Carla, this is just such a successful project. It gives students such a great experience. I think another thing that makes this really valuable is that we're moving our program fully online now. So, we still want to support opportunities for students who are locally based to do in-person activities. But also if we have remote students, it'll be really critical, I think, to give them this opportunity. So yes, Carla, please.
I think one of the things that I'm going to adjust, we are planning for a summer course. And last summer, I found it challenging to be there with the students every single time. And because of my schedule, the student schedule, especially in the summertime, everybody seemed to have to change their schedule. Not just the students, but me also. And so I'm going to pull in my colleagues at Minitex more. I'm going to rely on them more to help with that mentoring piece in the scheduling.
Nice. That was kind of a related question I have, because it does seem like an extremely time-consuming and new project that you did. So yeah, that's great that you have a support team that you can pull in. Yeah, it seems like a program that could even grow. Like I can imagine other places asking you to take part in the program as well. So I think we're down to 2 minutes left, and I think we got through our questions, but thank you so much for your presentation and sharing all about your program. Really, really cool program. And I think the next one will begin at 10:05 Pacific time. Sorry, that's where I am. So in about 10 minutes, 12 minutes technically, no matter where you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank everybody who came.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.